Hello and welcome to the Lanescape Livestream, an ongoing series where we spend our lunch hour taking a shallow dive into everything related to laneway housing. Today I'll be joined by Sean Galbraith, a professional planner who's also an advocate for infill and missing middle housing. Sean specializes in challenging approvals for laneway suites, including a multi-unit infill house our offices collaborated on earlier this summer. Since Sean works on projects that push the limits of the changing lanes bylaw, I want him to tell us where the policy is working and where it may need improvement, both to benefit architects and planners and to protect neighbors affected by this new typology. First, a bit of housekeeping. You may have heard that the emergency access requirements for laneway suites is going to be under review by the Housing and Planning Committee. This has the potential to dramatically increase the number of properties in Toronto that qualify for laneway suites as of right. That's going in front of the committee on the 17th, and we're expecting a report back from staff in September. Be sure to follow Lanescape's social media for updates on that. Also, our next laneway suite workshop will be July 29th. Be sure to register on our website, lanescape.ca, or through Eventbrite. We host those online, so this is a Zoom webinar. As many people can attend as they want, and it's always free. Finally, tune in to our next Lanescape live stream, where I'll be speaking with Dave LeBlanc, architecture writer for the Globe and Mail. He and I will be discussing the stories he's written about laneway housing over the past decade plus. Watch for the date on our website and social media. Now let's invite Sean in for a discussion.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Good. Sorry about that.
No problem. We have no shortage of technical difficulties on Lanescape live stream.
Well, I'm happy to keep the tradition alive.
I need to come up with a more foolproof way of broadcasting these, I think.
Well, it seems to work.
Yeah, and thanks for accommodating us later in the day. I know you've had a busy and eventful day fighting for laneway houses at Committee of Adjustment.
Shouldn't be fights, but there usually is.
Indeed. So let's start with that on a high level.
Sure.
Introduce us to yourselves and your company and what you do, both for laneway housing advocacy and for homeowners.
So I'm Sean Galbraith. I'm an urban planning consultant specializing in small project planning, minor variance work related to infill housing, missing middle, laneway suites, renovations, all that sort of stuff. I'm at committee pretty much every week. I like the small stuff, I've sort of focused my practice on specializing in it.
Well, and you seem to be pretty unique in that respect, in that you're a professional planner that works on houses and laneway suites. It doesn't seem like there are a lot in that segment of the market.
No, it's a lot of this is sort of too small for the big companies, and it's kind of what I like to work on. So I'm happy that it's sort of too small for them. And I get a lot of referrals from, some of the biggest companies in Toronto. It's just like, we don't really do houses. We're working on an 80-story giant condo building and an entire community master plan. Here, just you go take this. I'm like, yeah, okay. Perfect.
Well, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
I'd rather design a house on a high rise too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've worked on, in my career, I've worked on, giant towers, and I don't know, I kind of get bored of them. I don't like projects that take 3 years. I'd rather have a project that's done in a few months, and it's a little more fun on these small ones. I find there's less of a slog. They're not less challenging. Sometimes they can be a lot more challenging, but I don't know, I find them more fun.
And speaking of the challenges that come with these types of projects, give everyone an oversight of what it was like to do your job for a laneway house over 2 years ago, and since the changing lanes bylaws have been put in place. What did we do back then versus what we have to do now?
You always appealed your refusal, basically.
Guaranteed refusal, and go through an appeal process.
It was prior to the laneway suites bylaw. It was extremely difficult to get a laneway suite approved. Now, ironically, you could get a bigger one approved on that appeal, and you could sometimes get a coach house approved that you can't now. but you pretty much always had to appeal. You were almost always guaranteed to be refused because it just didn't meet the intent of the bylaw. It didn't meet the intent of the official plan, and it probably wasn't minor. So it's like you just sort of assume that you're going to get refused, and you head to the back then you head to the Ontario Municipal Board, where you might get approved.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I got one approved at C of A, but that's it.
There were a few that sort of slipped through in the like on Beaconsfield and sort of West Queen Westy area. There's a few that have that got approved, back under the old bylaw, including one that I found yesterday. It was a 3-story laneway suite, but they were not particularly common, and it was always like a site by site fight.
Well, and it was the ultimate irony mentioning a 3-story laneway house. Before an as of right policy was put in place, you're right that it was harder to get approval and you had to go through a much longer and more expensive process. But that meant that we got really, really big laneway houses.
Absolutely.
Because it didn't make sense to go through that fight for what we consider to be reasonable today, and it's easy to get today. You had to go for some monstrosity to make it worthwhile.
Yeah, and I mean, and there's some pretty great 3-story laneway houses out there. There's one behind Foxley. There's this one on Beaconsfield. There's some nice ones that actually got through that process. But boy, it was a process, and you had to really want to do it because it was high risk that you would get refused, and it was going to cost you a lot of money.
So let's quantify that for homeowners who are listening. Before, how long did it take to get approval for a laneway suite, and what did it cost the homeowner to get a building permit versus today?
Well, I don't know about building permits, but it would probably. So let's say you had, if we're comparing to the same piece of property, one that now is laneway suites bylaw compatible, versus before when it just wasn't. So you'd be looking in the olden era of 2 years ago, and it's only been 2 years that we've been allowed to do them after a 30-year fight to get them permitted. Back then, you would be looking at, so you'd have your committee of adjustment application, so you've got a few $1,000s there, and then you've got, you probably have a consultant or two, maybe a lawyer involved. So a few more $1,000s there. And let's say you're at about, I don't know, let's say you're at 10 grand to get through the committee of adjustment process back then. Then you get refused, of course. And so then you go to the OMB back then. You're probably looking at, I don't know, $25,000, $30,000 for your appeal, give or take. Now, if you need to appeal these days, you're still up in that kind of dollar value range. But if you have a property where you don't even need variances, which is, the intent of the bylaw, then great. You just go straight to building permits. You cut all that money out. You cut out, probably 1.5 to 2 years of process. It's fantastic. It seems to be working as intended too, which is nice.
Yeah, it went from something that was about 2 years in length and at least $50,000 in cost when you include the architectural, down to something that's 2 to 3 months and $10,000 to $20,000.
Huge difference.
So it's 100% certainty. Has that put you out of a job?
No, because no one was doing them before anyway.
So
if anything,
more people need your services to try to fight for that little bit of extra at C of A now?
So now you can, the nice thing is because they're allowed by the bylaw, now you can have a conversation as to, is this setback a little bit too small, too big? You can start fine tuning things, and you don't have to pay a development charge on it. Before pre-bylaw, you had to pay a development charge on that extra unit. Adding another however many tens of thousands of dollars to that fee. So I I have worked on 7 or 8 applications right now for Laneway Suite minor variances, but they're always like one, maybe 2 variances. Most people are coming pretty close to getting an perfectly as of right Laneway Suite, and sometimes there's just unique conditions with the property where you need a variance, or for landscaping or side yard setback or something like that. But you're not seeing, like before, your list of pre Laneway Suites bylaw, your list of variances was like 20 variances long. Like, it was a massive list. And they were not small variant. They were major variances sometimes.
Yeah, we basically never go to committee of adjustment for projects in our office. The only time we do is one that we worked on together, where
Yeah.
such a unique property. We
Mhm.
really should have been able to put 4 laneway houses on this very oddly shaped, key-shaped lot.
Mhm.
Instead, we got approval for what is, I believe, a very modest 2-unit laneway
Mhm.
house.
It was great.
So that was a
Really.
circumstance where we could have done something fully as of right,
Mhm.
but the conditions allowed us to get something that was significantly different than the bylaw allows.
Absolutely.
What are you telling people who are trying to get these nitpicky variances for something that's really close on like soft landscaping or building height or the like? Do you find
Mhm.
it's still worth going to committee, or is it a fight you shouldn't undertake?
I've seen the committee being pretty flexible in terms of laneway suites. I was doing some research for a project that I had at committee today, um, and looking through the variances for that neighborhood, I came across one for a new laneway suite, um, and there were three or four variances for it, and it got approved. I think the committee is starting to become a little more comfortable and familiar with the bylaw, and that little tweaks are okay. They don't need to be afraid of them like they were in the first 6 to 12 months of the bylaw,
Right.
at least in downtown district, where they have a lot more comfort and exposure and familiarity with laneway suites, as opposed to, say, in the Tobico district, where the opportunities for laneway suites to come before the committee of adjustment are just fewer, because there just aren't as many lanes.
Right. And can you give me some insight, help me as an
Mhm.
architect? What are some common mistakes you're seeing, not necessarily your clients, but all the
Mhm.
projects that go to C of A for laneway suites? What are some common mistakes people are making that might make them less favorable to the committee versus ones that they're likely to be more lenient on?
I haven't seen many mistakes, frankly. All of the laneway suite variances that I've seen go to committee um, have either been approved, or if a project was refused, it was refused for reasons other than for the laneway suite. Like the one I was there on today, it got refused, but it had nothing to do with the laneway suite. It had to do with the house itself. Um, and so architects, frankly, haven't been making mistakes. They have been, trying to stick to the bylaw, which, that's the intent of the bylaw, is to try and, match it. And there's been a lot of success with people getting variances to it, because they're not pushing the envelope badly. There are good reasons why, the ridiculous, soft landscaping inside the lane thing gets variances all the time, because it's really hard to meet that one. Or the interior yard soft landscaping gets approved because maybe the lot had 0 backyard soft landscaping to begin with, because the old bylaw didn't require any. Um, and so, it's an improvement. Um, or there are weird, unique circumstances, like you have these big existing garages, and you want to use the existing footprint, and it may not comply with the bylaw. So you make the second story comply with the bylaw. And so there are logical reasons, and that these variances um, are being put forward. And so it's reasonable that they're getting approved. And I think most of them, the vast majority of them, are getting approved. Possibly because architects are being a little more conservative right now. They aren't pushing the envelope too much. But you know, I think on it, we've pushed the envelope a little bit on a couple of our projects. I think it's somewhat arguable that the project that you and I worked on together pushed the envelope a little bit. It had good reasons to do so, and it was a reasonable edge of the envelope to push. But you know, it's most of them are pretty much going in as the bylaw intends. That angular plane is being provided. You know, it's gonna be fine.
I think it's just because the policy is so good. Not that I'm biased.
It's pretty good. Like, it is pretty good. There are, you know, there's always things that, you know, I would like to see maybe a little bit changed, like that angular plane, for example. But, you know, as a first blush sort of bylaw for something that, you know, is pretty new in Toronto and we didn't have a lot of experience with, even though lots of other municipalities had them already, and it took us 30 years to catch up. You know, it's a good bylaw. It's a good bylaw, and it's having success because we're getting a whole bunch of them being proposed and approved, even with some little variances.
So that's where I want to go next with you. What are the things that we should be looking at adjusting in the bylaw? I like the angular plane, so let's start with that one and be the devil's advocate here. Why is the angular plane something we should get rid of?
I generally,
in case any listeners don't understand what we're talking about.
Okay, so if you want to do a laneway suite, a 2-story laneway suite, you've got your main wall, the back wall of the house. Then you're allowed to go 7.5 meters. And from that point, if you draw a line up 4 meters and put a 45-degree angle there, your laneway suite has to fit within that box. This is called the angular plane.
In post-production, I'll overlay a diagram on what you
What? This isn't good enough? Come on. And so the intent of that is to prevent basically shadows from falling on neighboring properties. I think the value of that angular plane is effectively nothing. It's as close to nothing as you can get. I'm generally anti-angular planes in general. I hate them. So I think that the benefit of extra square footage in the house to make a, you know, bigger, livable, family-sized unit, I think outweighs the value of that angular plane.
Right.
Maybe having some sort of a notchy thing there is still good,
right.
But
my response to those criticisms that I've heard before is that if you have a deeper backyard and you go beyond that prescribed angular plane, then you can still have a vertical wall. It's only in those really small rear yard situations where we have really pinched backyards. So
totally.
Let's agree to disagree on that one.
I think in those, but I think if you know, looking at what is the actual shadow impact in those cases? Like how much for how long a time? I would suspect it is very little for not that long compared to the rest of the mass of the building and trees and fences. I think the actual on the ground impact of that angular plane is probably not that much.
And just to nerd out on this to its fullest extent, does this mean you're also opposed to the angular plane in the mid-rise guidelines too?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's crap.
Explain that one to me.
Yeah, so the angular plane and mid-rise guideline is to protect the shadowing on overprotected residential lands that are on either side of it. Because Toronto's official plan says we're going to cram all of the density that we need and all of the new units in the city on these thin little ribbons of mixed use red on the official plan. And everything else on one lot deep behind it, we have to protect it from shadow, but not tree shadows. Tree shadows are okay. Building shadows are bad. We rate shadows differently. And so, yeah, you can build one type of mid-rise building in Toronto, a sort of Mayan pyramid, stepped birthday cake kind of thing, and they all end up looking the same out the back. I don't know.
Do you have a
Again,
similar concern with the Laneway Suite bylaw? Because I am finding a lot of them are starting to look the same.
yeah, you can design one building. You can change some of the accoutrements and some of the, whatever, but it's designed, the Laneway Suite bylaw is designed to create one type of building.
So what's the happy medium? How can we ingrain something into the policy that would allow for more expression without violating the privacy and shadow concerns of the neighbors?
First, I don't care about the privacy concerns. I also don't care about the shadow concerns. You live in a dense city. There are windows that face your yard. I mean, there is no privacy in a city. Like, we have to disavow ourselves of this notion that there's somehow, I don't know, privacy in a backyard in downtown Toronto. Like, it just doesn't exist.
Well, surely you can agree, though, that the proximity...
I assure you I probably cannot agree.
The proximity of those new windows is going to be a lot closer to your backyard and facing into your house when you compare it to a house across the laneway.
No, it's compared to the house that you're living next to. But that house can see into your backyard right now totally fine.
Indeed, but not vice versa. So it's not windows facing windows per se.
If I'm in my backyard, I assure you I can see into your second story window.
Well, I love how liberal your interpretations are of these planning requirements.
Very much so.
That's why you're my friend who I want to continue advocating for housing policy.
I don't get a lot of uptake in what I advocate for. I lose a lot of fights.
Well,
but I keep yelling on Twitter about it anyway.
I mean, it's your job to question policies like this, and I really appreciate your perspective on all of it. And so let's sort of transfer that perspective to the city just released a fairly innocuous report on missing middle housing for the city and sort of their plan to start tackling what that looks like issue by issue to sort of fill in the policy between a mid-rise building and a laneway suite. Can you give us your initial reaction on that?
So it is exactly the report and recommendations requests that you would expect to receive at this stage of the process. Right now, so by way of background, a year ago, City Council directed the Planning Department to start looking at how can we add additional people density, additional units in established neighborhoods, especially where they are strictly prohibited from going right now, i.e. the RD zone, the residential detached only zone. But also looking at the more permissive R zone in primarily old downtown Toronto. And the first bit of this project is going to Planning and Housing Committee on Monday. What's going to there is basically the initial report and recommendations that they accepted, and they allow the planning department to start doing public consultation on it to figure out what are these changes actually going to look like, because they provided no actual policy recommendations at this point, which I wouldn't have expected them to do, because they haven't talked to anybody yet. They're not going to come out and say, hey, this is what we want to do. We haven't talked to anyone about it. Establish the problem before you establish solutions. Makes sense. Yeah, exactly. And find out what some of those solutions could be. So do you feel optimistic about what you've seen from it? Are you excited about what could be happening in all the R zones, the yellow belt of the city? So by my nature, I am cautiously pessimistic. I would agree with you, except take out the word cautiously. I expect the worst will happen. especially when Toronto Council gets a hold of whatever it is this turns out to be. This is the same council that didn't permit a house to have a second front door if it led to a secondary suite. Your house can have as many front doors as you want. The entire front of your house could be all front doors, so long as none of them lead to a secondary suite.
Which, by the way,
love
you
zoning.
should design a house like that just to spite city.
I absolutely want someone to do that. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I want to be the planner on that file. Absolutely.
So your point's well taken, but they're also the council that approved the changing lanes bylaw. So how do we balance?
Barely.
Well, they did it though.
They did it by some sort of like parliamentarian trickery. It was not a guarantee by any stretch that even the one that was the original one in 2018 that only applied to downtown and had no suburban councillors involved in it, which is why it only applied to downtown. Like even that could have been defeated at council if it were not for some smart ways of doing things. And so a year ago, when the missing middle request went to council, the signals were already there that this was going to be a fight from the usual suspects, from Willowdale and from Etobicoke Center. The fight will be on. It won't matter what it says, frankly. The fight will be on. Mm-hmm. But the request to Planning and Housing Committee says a lot of the things that I would want it to say. You know, I'm a huge missing middle advocate. I yell about this on Twitter all the time. I don't know why anybody follows me. And it says a lot of good things without saying too much, because at this stage, the goal is basically to get it out of committee and get it past council. So so the report is going to committee, and it says, hey, committee, can you approve us to actually do this work? And then committee will presumably say, yeah, of course, obviously, go ahead and do the work. Mm-hmm. But if it said too much, then when that recommendation gets out of committee and goes to council, the next council meeting, mm-hmm. the suburban councillors could be like, no, we don't want this, and then just kill the whole thing right at the start.
Right.
We don't want to do that, obviously. So, but what this says is we want to do things like allowing for triplexes in all residential zones. That's great. I like that. We want to look at doing small apartment buildings, maybe on like major streets within neighborhood designated lands, mm-hmm. like, I don't know, maybe like Dover Court or something.
Sure.
That makes sense to me. And we want to look at things like coach houses, laneway suites where there's no lanes. Hamilton allows this. The Ottawa was very progressive in that. Everybody's favorite urbanist city of Windsor allows them. Let's let Toronto catch up to Windsor, Hamilton, parts of Markham, and Ottawa. We'll see. That part is going to be a huge fight. I will be shocked if that one gets through council whenever it is that it comes back.
And that's the one I'm most interested in too.
Of course.
It being a very similar pattern and policy and advocacy module.
Absolutely.
As laneway suites was.
And it's interesting, coach houses in some respect were almost easier to get approved prior to the laneway suites bylaw. Even though each one was a fight, you didn't have to make an argument that they were specifically excluded from consideration by the laneway suites bylaw itself. And like I got a coach house approved at the OMB, of course, with a lot severance. This was probably 12 or 13 years ago. And there are a bunch of coach houses out there that sort of got through prior to the laneway suites bylaw, but I don't know of a single one that has been approved since the laneway suite bylaw.
Right.
Yeah.
I have had one refuse the committee of adjustment, and I
Yep.
really wanted to appeal it at T-Lab, but the
Hmm.
clients want to be patient and see what happens with the policy. So
Sure.
can't blame them for that, but that was a fight I wanted to have, let me tell you.
That was a good project too. I remember
Mhm.
that one. But it's just, right now, if you want a coach house, you have to wait, really. Unless you can prove that there's a whole bunch of them in the area already, which just doesn't exist in
Doesn't
Toronto.
exist, yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully, I am cautiously pessimistic, but there's, you never know, maybe. Maybe coach houses are something that gets permitted starting maybe next year. Um, it's, we'll see. I don't know.
Be interesting. Well, I mean, part of the reason I think the Laneway sweep policy had success was because people like yourself were so outspoken on Twitter and at community
It
meetings to support them. So
helps. It helps.
I'm really hopeful that we can get our fellow Torontonians behind it and get it
Hmm.
through. Because in my opinion, that's what swayed the councillors in the downtown neighborhoods. Because I don't view
Absolutely.
this as a suburban opposition situation. I view this as a NIMBY opposition situation, and there are NIMBYs all over downtown who were influencing their councillors to oppose laneway sweep policy
Hmm.
right here in the core.
I agree.
We needed the people in favor of it to shout louder than the people opposed to it.
The it is it is so uncommon for people who support projects and initiatives to speak up and say that they do, that when it happens, it carries a lot more weight than some crappy change.org petition that has 300 people signing from California. Like, who cares about that? Nobody reads those things. Nobody cares about those things at all. Hint to NIMBYs, never use online petitions. They're garbage. And so if people who are following, if there are policies that you support, don't be silent about it. If you want to see positive change happen, say it. Tell your counselor, yeah, this is something that I support. That carries a lot of weight. They need, frankly, political cover to do things. And the Laneway Suites bylaw was successful because Lanescape, it was a ground up operation. It didn't come from the city at all. Frankly, the city was opposed to it at the start, and they had to be convinced that there was almost a critical mass of people who were supportive of this, bringing along two very supportive counselors, and did the hard work of getting this thing approved.
Well, and as you know, it wasn't just Lanescape, it was people like yourself. So,
Yeah, I just yell on Twitter.
well, we need more of that. And I really look forward to fighting for garden suite policy and all kinds of other housing
Absolutely.
policy with you. So,
I get calls. I get at least one call a week. Probably in the last month, I've gotten probably 12 calls from people who want to do garden suites, who want to do coach houses. Like, there's a lot of demand for it, and there are frankly way more lots that don't have lanes than that do have lanes. And there's an untapped resource for small, more affordable housing and multi-generational housing that we're just leaving on the table.
I couldn't agree more. Make sure you write their names down so we can call them out to some public meetings.
I keep a note of them. Absolutely. I'll send them your way.
Well, Sean, thanks so much for all the hard work you do and for joining me today. I really appreciate chatting with you.
Anytime.
And everyone who's listening, be sure to stay tuned for the next Lanescape live stream. That'll be coming out hopefully next week, where we'll be chatting with Dave LeBlanc, the architecture writer for the Globe and Mail. Thanks for joining us tonight. Be well, everyone, and we'll see you in the laneways.